What happens when a billionaire consumed by ambition unexpectedly reunites with the woman he once loved and lost? A woman who, after years of silence, now stands before him, not as the devoted wife he remembers, but as a call girl, living a life Ethan never imagined for her. Is it a chance for redemption, or too little, too late? As they confront the past and the choices they've made, can they find a way back to each other? Or are they forever haunted by the ghosts of their broken love? Will this reunion be their second chance or their final goodbye? If you enjoyed this intense journey through love, regret, and second chances, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Stay tuned for more gripping stories and unforgettable twists. You won't want to miss what happens next. The rain fell heavily, painting the city streets with dark, glossy reflections of neon lights and distant headlights. Ethan Sterling, billionaire mogul and self-made titan of industry, sat in the back of his sleek black SUV, lost in the maze of numbers, mergers, and corporate strategies that consumed his mind. His hand subconsciously gripped his smartphone, scrolling through emails, checking the market reports, and mentally preparing for the high-stakes meeting that awaited him. Every moment was a battle to maintain control, and he was determined not to lose focus, even for a second. As the vehicle glided through the rain-slicked streets, his thoughts remained fixed on the acquisition deal that could elevate his empire to new heights. He barely registered the city around him, the skyscrapers, the flood of pedestrians huddled under umbrellas, the blur of cars splashing through puddles. But then, something pulled his attention away from the chaos of the city. There, on the side of the road, standing against the downpour with one hand raised in a desperate plea for a ride, was a woman. Her figure was tall, her posture graceful even in the rain, and there was a certain stillness about her, a kind of quiet that contrasted sharply with the frenzied energy of the world around her. Ethan slowed the SUV, his mind unsure whether he was simply seeing a stranger or something more familiar. "Stop," he said quietly to the driver, his voice more a command than a suggestion. The car eased to a halt beside the woman, and as she approached the vehicle, her eyes briefly met his through the window. Ethan felt a sudden jolt, a flash of recognition that sent a shiver down his spine, but he couldn't place her. The feeling was fleeting, though unsettling. Without a word, the woman opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, her presence filling the car like a sudden shift in the atmosphere. "Where to?" Ethan asked, trying to shake off the inexplicable feeling of familiarity that lingered in the air. The woman settled into the seat, her movements measured and elegant. "Just drive," she said simply, her voice low and steady, though there was something about it, something almost too calm, too controlled, that caught his attention. She didn't offer a destination, and there was no urgency in her tone, only a quiet resolve. As the car pulled back into motion, Ethan stole another glance at her, trying to discern something, anything about this woman. She was striking, no doubt, but it was more than that. It was the way she held herself, confident, composed, yet with an undercurrent of something harder to define. There was an air of coldness about her, as if she was intentionally keeping a distance both physically and emotionally. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers seemed louder than it should have been, filling the silence between them. Isabella, as he would later come to know her, sat with an air of mystery. Her gaze was fixed outside the window, though Ethan sensed she was not merely lost in thought, but calculating, analyzing something, perhaps him. "You don't talk much, do you?" Ethan finally broke the silence, his curiosity getting the better of him. She turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes for the first time. Her expression remained unreadable, but there was a sharpness in her gaze that made him uneasy. "I talk when it matters," she replied, her tone measured but not unkind. Ethan found himself intrigued, though unsettled. Her responses were cryptic, guarded, more like a riddle than a conversation. She wasn't giving anything away, and it both frustrated and fascinated him. He wondered who she was, what her story was, and why she felt so familiar, like a ghost he couldn't quite recognize. "Do you know where you're going?" she asked, breaking the silence again, her voice a little softer now. He hesitated, unsure whether she was asking about the car's route or something deeper, something more personal. "To a meeting," he said, trying to steer the conversation towards safer ground. "And you?" "I'm just passing through," she said, and for the first time there was a slight shift in her voice, as if she was offering a little more than the cold reserve she had maintained before. "Just like you." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment Ethan was left with the unsettling feeling that they were both in this car for reasons that went beyond mere coincidence. He had picked her up on impulse, but now, as the car continued to cut through the rain-drenched streets, he couldn't shake the sense that this encounter was more than just a random meeting between a billionaire and a stranger. It felt fated somehow, like their paths had been destined to cross once more. The car turned a corner, and Isabella's eyes flicked briefly toward the side of the street, where a familiar building came into view. Ethan noticed the sudden shift in her posture, the tightening of her jaw. He followed her gaze, but the moment passed before he could ask what she was looking at. "How long has it been since you've been here?" Ethan finally ventured, unable to stop himself from asking the question that had been gnawing at him. Isabella didn't immediately answer. Instead, she glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. She opened her mouth to speak, but then stopped herself, as though weighing her words carefully. "Long enough," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, something heavy, laden with memories that neither of them had yet begun to unpack. As the car continued on its journey, the weight of her presence settled deeper into the air between them. Ethan knew there was more to this woman than met the eye, more to her than the mysterious exterior she presented. But the question still hung over him, unanswered. Who was she? And why did it feel like their lives had intersected once again, as though fate itself had orchestrated this encounter? It was a question he would soon find an answer to, though the truth might be more than he could ever have expected. The SUV rolled smoothly through the city streets, the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the hum of the engine filling the silence between them. Ethan glanced over at Isabella, her sharp features illuminated by the soft glow of street lights as they passed. There was something about her, the way she held herself, the way her eyes shifted, even the inflection in her voice, that felt unsettlingly familiar. It was more than just the feeling of recognition. It was the weight of a memory he couldn't quite place, something nagging at the edges of his consciousness. He had encountered many people throughout his life, business partners, associates, people from his past. But this woman, she felt like something different, someone he had known long ago, someone whose presence he had once cherished, then lost. His eyes flicked to her every so often as the minutes passed, studying her more closely. She was beautiful, undeniably so, but it was more than that. It was the confidence she exuded, the sharpness in her movements, and yet the cool detachment that seemed to radiate from her. She was composed, calm, but there was a sadness hidden beneath the surface, a faint trace of vulnerability she kept buried deep inside. Every time he tried to pin down the source of his unease, his mind would flash to some distant memory, a fleeting image, a vague sense of nostalgia, but nothing concrete enough to grasp. Her eyes seemed to whisper a name he couldn't remember, a place he couldn't place. They passed another intersection, and then, without warning, Isabella's posture shifted just slightly, as though something had caught her attention. Her face, which had remained impassive for most of the ride, seemed to tighten for a split second, as if something had stirred deep within her. Ethan watched as she glanced out the window, her eyes briefly lingering on a building they were passing. The subtle change in her expression didn't go unnoticed by him. He followed her gaze and found himself staring at the familiar skyline of the old neighborhood, the one he had once called home with Isabella. His heart skipped a beat. The last time he had been here, it had been with her, when their lives were intertwined, when everything had felt real. For the first time since he picked her up, the mystery of her presence in the car seemed to shift into something much more personal. The realization struck him like a wave. This was no coincidence. Suddenly the pieces began to fit together. His breath caught as his mind raced through the past, searching for answers in the depths of memory. This neighborhood, the streets lined with familiar trees and old buildings. She used to live here. Isabella's voice broke through his thoughts almost casually. "I used to live here, until everything fell apart." Her words were soft, almost a whisper, but they hit Ethan with the force of a wrecking ball. The blood in his veins froze as he processed what she had said. He wasn't sure if she meant it to be a clue, but it felt like one. The moment those words left her lips, the floodgates in his mind opened wide. The house, the warmth of their first home together, their shared dreams, the late-night talks about the future, about love, about family, the days when they were everything to each other, before ambition and neglect tore them apart. The betrayal, the anger, the divorce. He had blocked it all out, buried it beneath the weight of his career, his success. But now, hearing those words, seeing her again, everything came rushing back. Isabella, his ex-wife. The woman he had loved and lost, the woman who had disappeared from his life after everything had crumbled, the woman who had somehow slipped through his grasp, and now here she was, sitting beside him in the back of his car, as though no time had passed at all. Ethan's heart raced, and for a moment he struggled to catch his breath. "Isabella," he whispered almost involuntarily. The name tasted foreign, yet achingly familiar on his tongue. She turned to him slowly, her eyes meeting his with a quiet, almost resigned expression. There was no shock on her face, no recognition of the emotional bomb her words had just dropped. She simply looked at him, as if she had expected this moment to come eventually. Ethan could barely process it. She was sitting there right next to him, as if she were just any other passenger. But she wasn't. She was the woman who had once been his everything, the woman he had vowed to love and protect, only to let slip through his fingers. For the first time in years, the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself started to crumble. He felt a rush of emotions, regret, longing, guilt, and confusion all crashing together. His gaze never left hers as he tried to find the right words, but nothing seemed adequate. "Why didn't you tell me it was you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella's lips parted as if to speak, but for a moment she seemed to hesitate. Finally, she spoke softly. "It wasn't the right time. Ethan, I wasn't sure if it ever would be." The words hung between them, and Ethan felt an overwhelming wave of emotion surge through him. Grief for the years lost, anger at himself for not seeing this coming, and a deep ache for the woman he had once loved. Her presence in his life now, so unexpectedly, seemed almost like fate mocking him. They had both moved on, or so he thought, yet here they were, tied together once more by the ghosts of the past, unwilling to be forgotten, unwilling to let go. As the car continued down the familiar streets, Ethan couldn't help but wonder, had this moment been inevitable? Had they both been living with the weight of their past, both wondering what might have been even as they tried to move on? Isabella, his ex-wife, his lost love, was sitting beside him once again. The question now was, what would they do with this unexpected encounter? And more importantly, what would it mean for the both of them? The car hummed steadily through the rain-soaked streets, but Ethan's mind had long since drifted elsewhere. Isabella sat beside him, but he wasn't seeing her anymore. Instead, his mind was pulled back into the past, where everything, his ambition, their love, and their marriage had unraveled. It was a different time, a time when the world outside their home felt like a distant blur. Ethan remembered the early days of their marriage, when their apartment was their world. They had been young, full of dreams and aspirations, their love vibrant and unwavering. They had built a life together, hand in hand, believing that nothing could tear them apart. He could still recall the warmth of Isabella's laugh, the way her eyes would light up when they talked about their future, about the family they would one day have. But as the years passed, things changed. Ethan's career took off in ways he hadn't expected. His rise in the business world was meteoric, his focus laser-sharp. There were deals to make, meetings to attend, and an empire to build. And slowly, like a creeping shadow, work began to take over his life. What had once been shared moments and quiet evenings became late nights at the office and early mornings filled with conference calls. His drive for success began to eclipse everything else, especially Isabella. Ethan had been so caught up in climbing the ladder, so consumed by his own ambition, that he hadn't seen the cracks forming beneath the surface of his marriage. Isabella had become a stranger in her own home, her bright smile replaced by a quiet resignation. The emotional distance between them grew, and though Ethan noticed, he was too wrapped up in his own pursuits to recognize it for what it was. And then, one night, the truth came crashing down. It was a rainy evening just like this one, and Ethan had come home late from yet another business trip. He'd opened the door to their apartment, his mind already focused on a new proposal he had to finalize, when he found her. Isabella, standing in the hallway, her face pale and tear-streaked. She had barely looked at him as he walked in, her expression filled with guilt and shame. It wasn't until he noticed the man standing behind her, someone Ethan didn't recognize, that his world came crumbling down. The pieces fell into place as if the universe had decided to drop the truth in his lap. Isabella's affair. It wasn't just a fling. It wasn't a mistake. It was a betrayal of everything they had shared. The pain of seeing the woman he loved in someone else's arms, the woman who had promised to be his, shattered him. Ethan's heart raced as the anger bubbled up inside him. He didn't know what to do with it, how to process it. He had always prided himself on control, on being able to fix things. But this was something he couldn't fix. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow as his mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, but instead, he stood there in stunned silence, unable to speak. Isabella, her eyes avoiding his, finally said the words that broke him. "I'm sorry, Ethan, I never meant for it to happen this way. But I couldn't keep waiting for you." The words hit harder than any affair ever could. It wasn't just the betrayal of her body, it was the betrayal of the emotional neglect he had subjected her to for so long. He had been so focused on his success, on his career, that he had failed to see her slipping away. He had failed to see the woman he loved slowly dying inside, craving attention, affection, a connection, anything that would make her feel seen again. "I never asked you to wait," he had said, his voice tight with the hurt he couldn't hide. "I didn't even see you anymore." Her tear-filled eyes met his, and for the first time, Ethan saw the raw truth in them. "I needed you, Ethan. I needed you to see me. But you were always too busy, too focused on your deals, your empire, your success. And I couldn't keep waiting for you to notice that I was still here." In that moment, Ethan's anger gave way to guilt. The realization slammed into him. He had ignored her. He had been so obsessed with his vision of success that he had neglected the one person who had always been there, the one person who had supported him through everything. The betrayal wasn't just her affair. It was the way he had betrayed her emotionally long before anyone else could. The argument that followed was a blur. Words were exchanged, painful, angry words, but nothing was ever the same after that night. The betrayal cut deep, but it wasn't just the affair that broke them. It was the years of emotional neglect that had come before it. It was Ethan's failure to be the partner she needed. It was his unwillingness to notice the cracks in their marriage until it was too late. The flashback receded, but the weight of it lingered, pulling Ethan back into the painful present. His heart ached with the memories of that time, of how things had fallen apart so quickly, so violently. He hadn't just lost Isabella to another man, he had lost her to his own selfishness. And in that loss he had lost himself too. Beside him Isabella sat in silence, the tension between them thicker than ever. He could feel her gaze, sharp and unyielding, but also tinged with something softer, something that still cared. Despite everything that had happened, the realization was sudden and sharp. Isabella had never forgiven herself for the affair. She had carried the weight of that guilt for years, but she wasn't the only one to blame. Ethan had been blind to his own role in their destruction. And now as they sat together in the car, he knew that nothing would ever truly heal unless they both confronted the scars they had left on each other. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The ghosts of their past would never fully let them go. The car hummed steadily, cutting through the rain-slicked streets, but the tension in the air was thick. Ethan's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale against the dark leather. His mind raced as he processed the weight of everything Isabella had just revealed. The affair, the betrayal, the years of emotional neglect. His chest tightened, and the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly. Just as the road behind him had, an uncharted path filled with mistakes and regrets. The silence between them deepened, suffocating, as Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel Isabella's gaze on him, though she hadn't said a word in what seemed like forever. Their eyes met briefly in the rearview mirror, and in that fleeting moment something passed between them, an unspoken understanding, a brief but intense recognition of the past they both carried. It was as if the years had collapsed in on themselves, and in that instant they were no longer two strangers sharing a ride. They were the people they had once been, bound by the ghosts of their former selves. Ethan's heart raced as he struggled to breathe, the weight of guilt, regret, and the endless years of separation crashing over him. He had tried to bury it all, to move forward with his life, but now, with Isabella sitting next to him, everything came rushing back. The love, the pain, the loss. The silence was unbearable. Finally, Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. The question had been clawing at him since she first stepped into the car. His voice broke through the quiet, rough and raw, but tinged with a desperate need for answers. "Why are you here, Isabella?" he asked. His eyes still fixed on the road, his voice strained. "After all this time, why now?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of the past. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, but he didn't dare look at her. He didn't know if he was ready for what she might say, but he had to know. The uncertainty was eating away at him, leaving him with more questions than answers. Isabella was silent for a long moment. Her eyes were focused on the passing cityscape, but he could feel her hesitation, the battle waging behind her carefully controlled exterior. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, but it carried a weight that made Ethan's chest tighten even further. "I've been trying to move on, Ethan," she began, her words slow, deliberate. "I've built a life for myself, in ways I never thought I could. I've tried to leave everything behind, the hurt, the anger, the memories of us." She paused, her gaze flickering toward him before looking away again. "But sometimes the past doesn't let you go. And when things started falling apart again, when certain events in my life forced me to come back, it felt like I had no choice." Ethan's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" The words felt like an accusation, but there was no malice behind them, only confusion and a growing sense of dread. She turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. The coldness was gone, replaced with something more vulnerable, something raw. "I came back because I never really left, Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You never left me. I've tried to move on, tried to build something new, but every time I thought I could, something brought me back here, to you, to this city, to the place where everything started and ended." Her words hit Ethan like a punch. He had never expected this. The woman who had walked away from their marriage, who had built a life of her own, was now telling him that she had never truly moved on either. He had assumed she had just walked away, left him to drown in his own success. But now he was faced with the reality that, even after all these years, the past still haunted them both. The silence between them deepened again, but this time it felt different. The air was heavy with unspoken emotions, things that neither of them had dared to confront for years. Ethan's mind raced, but he couldn't find the words. He had wanted answers, but now that he had them, he wasn't sure what to do with them. "You've been living your life building something without me," he said, his voice tight, almost bitter. "And I've just been pretending that everything was fine, that I could move on. But it wasn't, it never was, and now I don't know what to do with all of this. With you. With us?" Isabella's eyes softened, but there was no trace of the coldness she had once held so tightly. Instead, there was something more vulnerable, something deeper, a woman who had been hurt, who had carried the weight of their past just as much as he had. "I don't know either." "Ethan," she said, her voice barely audible, "I don't know what we can fix. I don't know if there's anything left to fix. But I've lived with this guilt for so long, wondering if things could have been different if I hadn't given up on us. I'm not asking for us to go back to what we were, but I can't keep pretending either. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. The rawness in her words made Ethan's chest tighten. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't asking him to make things right. But she was asking for something else, something he hadn't given her before, the chance to face the truth, the chance to confront the past they had buried so deep. As they drove through the rain-slick streets, the weight of their shared history hung between them, a fragile thread that had never truly snapped. The conversation had shifted, no longer just a confrontation of blame and hurt, but a moment of reckoning. A moment where both of them were forced to acknowledge the mistakes, the pain, and the lost time. Ethan couldn't stop the flood of emotions that came crashing down: anger, regret, confusion. And somewhere beneath it all, a flicker of hope. A faint, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. But the question loomed large. Was it too late? Could they ever undo the damage? Or had they already crossed a line that could never be erased? Each word from Isabella cut deep, but Ethan couldn't stop himself from listening. The raw vulnerability between them was something neither had shown in years, and yet it left them both exposed, unsure of what came next. The confrontation had brought them face to face with the ghosts of their past, but the question remained: could they finally face those ghosts and move forward, or would they be forever trapped in the past? The city blurred past the windows as the SUV made its way through the rain-soaked streets. The sound of the wipers, a soft rhythmic backdrop to the tension that had once again filled the air between them. Ethan sat stiffly, his hands still gripping the wheel, his mind spinning from everything they had just confronted. The past, the betrayal, the years of separation. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he had realized. More that he hadn't known about Isabella's life since they had parted ways. Isabella sat beside him, her gaze now fixed out the window, but Ethan could feel the weight of her silence. He had already learned more about her than he had expected tonight, the emotional scars, the shared history. But he hadn't been prepared for the revelation that was about to come. She took a deep breath, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, before she spoke again. Her voice was soft, but it held the sharpness of something long buried, something she had carried with her for years. "I'm not just here to visit old memories. Ethan," she said, her tone steady but laced with an undertone of something darker. "I've been living a different life, one that you don't know about." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Her words hung in the air like a silent warning, and for a brief moment he didn't know if he was ready to hear what she was about to say. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice thick with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Isabella's eyes flicked to him for a brief moment, but she didn't immediately answer. Her gaze drifted again to the passing city, but this time there was a weariness in her eyes, a sorrow he hadn't seen before. "I've become someone I never thought I would be, Ethan," she continued quietly. "I'm a call girl. I work in the city's underbelly, selling sexual services. I know it's not what you imagined for me, but it's what I've had to do to survive." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had shared his life with, had become someone he could barely recognize. He thought he knew her, but this was a side of her life he had never imagined. Isabella's voice remained calm, but Ethan could hear the tremor beneath her words. "I didn't choose this path, Ethan. It wasn't my first choice. But after everything that happened, after the betrayal, after you left me alone in the wreckage of our marriage, I had to make choices, and none of them were easy." Ethan felt as though the world had shifted beneath him. His mind raced, trying to process the truth in her words. He had never imagined this life for her, never even considered that she might have been forced into this. His assumptions, his view of her life since their divorce, had been shattered in an instant. He had been blind. He had been so focused on his own success, his own world, that he had never stopped to think about the consequences of his neglect, how it had pushed her to a place so far removed from the life they had once dreamed of. His chest tightened, and the words that came next felt like a raw admission of guilt. "I didn't know, Isabella. I didn't know that you were struggling like this." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of everything he had failed to see crashing over him. Isabella turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like hours. "Of course you didn't. You never noticed, Ethan. You were too busy building your empire. I was just—" The woman waiting at home forgotten in the process. Her words, though sharp, were not without sorrow. Ethan could see the pain behind her eyes, and it hit him harder than anything else. He had failed her. He had been so consumed by his own dreams that he hadn't seen the woman in front of him slowly breaking down, losing herself. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of what she had just revealed. Ethan's mind raced, torn between anger, regret, and a growing sense of helplessness. He had pushed her to this life, this world of survival and choices he never thought she'd make. And now, sitting beside him, she was no longer the woman he remembered. She had become someone else, someone shaped by the world he had failed to protect her from. But in the midst of all of this, there was still something between them. Fair flicker of the past, a faint glimmer of the connection they had once shared. As the car continued down the rain-soaked streets, Ethan felt a shift inside him. Despite the betrayal, despite everything that had come before, there was still a part of him that couldn't let go. The woman who sat beside him, so different now, was still Isabella. She still carried the weight of the love they once had, the love he had once given her, however flawed it had been. For the first time in a long while, Ethan found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. Could they still find a way back to each other? Or had the damage been done so deeply that they were beyond repair? Isabella, too, seemed lost in thought, her eyes distant but not completely closed off. She hadn't forgiven herself for the choices she had made, and neither had he. But in the fragile silence between them, there was still something that refused to be extinguished. A bond that had once been their foundation, and now seemed like a fragile thread they both held onto, unwilling to let go, even though the road ahead was uncertain. "I never stopped thinking about you," Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence. "Even after everything. I never stopped wondering what would have happened if we had tried harder, if I had been there for you." Isabella didn't reply immediately. Instead, she let the words sink in, her gaze softening slightly. "I never stopped either," she whispered almost to herself. "But sometimes the past is too heavy to carry." A deep sigh escaped Ethan's lips as he turned his attention back to the road. The truth was painful, but it was the first step toward understanding. They were both scarred by the past, by their mistakes and the paths they had taken. But as the car made its way through the city, there was a flicker of hope, however faint, that maybe, just maybe, they could still find a way to heal. Maybe their story wasn't completely over, but only time would tell if they could ever find their way back to each other, or if they were doomed to continue living in the shadows of their past. The city lights stretched ahead, a blurred sea of neon and street lamps that flickered in the rain-soaked night. Inside the SUV, the silence between Ethan and Isabella was suffocating, laden with the weight of everything they had just revealed to each other. Ethan's mind was spinning, his thoughts jumbled and conflicted as he tried to process the woman sitting beside him, the woman who had once been his world. The one who had stood by his side had become something else entirely, someone he had never imagined. She had taken control of her own life in ways he never thought she was capable of. The woman who had once been his simple, devoted housewife had carved out a new existence in a world Ethan had never known, a world so far removed from the life they had shared. Isabella had become stronger than he had ever expected, a woman who had survived her own battles, who had chosen a different path when life had left her with no other options. She had rebuilt herself from the wreckage of their marriage, not just physically but emotionally, and now sitting beside him, she was someone he no longer recognized completely. But at the same time, she was still the woman he had loved, the woman whose memory he couldn't shake. So even after all these years, Ethan couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for her, even in the midst of the pain. She had done what he never could. She had moved on, not just from him, but from the world he had tried to trap her in. She had made her own way, despite everything that had happened between them, but it was more complicated than that. The truth of their shared history, the betrayals, the broken promises, still loomed between them like a shadow. Ethan could feel the walls she had built, the distance she had placed between them, even though they were in the same car, in the same moment. She had changed, and so had he. The woman sitting beside him was no longer the same woman he had married, and perhaps neither was he. He turned to her, his voice tight with emotion. "Isabella, I don't know what to do with all of this. I don't know if I can just let you go again. But you've changed, and I've changed too." She turned her gaze to him, her eyes softer now, but there was no denying the distance that still remained between them. "You can't just pick up where we left off, Ethan. I've made a life for myself. I've found some peace, but the past, what we were, it still haunts me. I'm not sure there's room for you in my life anymore." Her words hit Ethan hard, but he couldn't deny the truth in them. She had found peace in her own way without him, and that was something he hadn't expected. She was no longer the woman who needed him to define her. She had built her own identity, separate from the man who had failed her. "I'm not asking for you to forget the past, Isabella," Ethan said, his voice rough. "I know I hurt you. I know I failed you in so many ways, but I can't just walk away from you again. I never wanted to let you go in the first place." Isabella's eyes softened, but the guarded look in them remained. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Ethan. I don't know if I can let you back in. The pain of what we went through is still here in both of us." Ethan's chest tightened. The words felt like a dagger to his heart. He had been so consumed by his ambition, by his own success, that he hadn't realized how far he had pushed her away. Now sitting beside him, he understood just how much damage had been done. He had let his own selfishness tear apart the one thing he had once loved most. But despite everything, despite the distance between them, there was still something there. A flicker of the love they had shared, however complicated and broken it was. It wasn't gone. It was buried beneath layers of pain and resentment, but it was still there. And perhaps that was the hardest part of all, to know that a part of them could still be connected, despite everything they had been through. The car continued its journey through the city, the lights passing in a blur as neither of them spoke. The tension between them hung thick, unresolved, like a question left unanswered. Both of them were standing at the edge of something they couldn't quite define, something that might pull them back into each other's lives, or send them farther apart. As the car turned down another street, the light from the city flickering through the window, Ethan found himself faced with a question that seemed impossible to answer. Could they ever truly move on from the past? Could they rebuild what had been lost, or were they doomed to remain ghosts of each other, haunted by what could have been? Isabella's voice cut through the silence again, quiet but resolute. "I don't know what's going to happen, Ethan. Maybe this is just closure. Maybe this is where our story ends." The words hung in the air like a final exhale, and Ethan couldn't find the words to respond. He wanted to say something, anything, to fix it, to make things right. But he didn't know how. The road ahead was as uncertain as the road behind them. The car came to a stop at a red light, and for a moment neither of them moved. The city around them seemed to disappear as they sat in the quiet, suspended in time, caught between the past and the future. Would they try again? Would they try to rebuild what they once had, despite the years and the pain? Or was this encounter simply a moment of closure, the final chapter in a love story long gone? The light turned green, but neither of them moved. The moment lingered in the air unanswered, leaving both of them with the same question. What now? And as the car continued down the road, neither of them knew if this was the beginning of something new, or the end of everything they had once shared.